Hello, and welcome to Catholicism in the Car. My name is Parker Zerbal. I mentioned last time that I had recently attended an ordination mass and also the first mass of a good friend of mine, now Father Lee Allen Fortin. And I have to say, his first mass was probably the most beautiful Novus Ordo mass I have ever seen. I was telling some people about this after, and a few agreed. They said maybe not the most beautiful he's ever seen. One friend told me, but pretty close. So they were able to have, two deacons there. They were able to do it ad orientem, a really good balance of Latin and English. All of the music was either a Gregorian chant or polyphony. It was something right out of the documents on the liturgy of the Second Vatican Council, the main one being Sacrosanctum Concilium. That Mass, I think, is a very good example of what the Church meant by its liturgical reforms in the 1960s and 70s. What we actually got, on the other hand, was, in most places, in the U.S. at least, what we got was quite lacking. Now, I am not someone who says that we need to go back to the traditional Latin Mass. I think I've discussed this before. Would I be opposed to going back to the traditional Latin Mass? Not necessarily. But I do think the reforms were necessary. And I do think that there can be even a greater amount of beauty in the Novus Ordo if it is done as the Council intended it. And a Novus Ordo done in that way is I think, very much akin to the transitional Mass that existed for, 5 years, I think, between 1965 and 1971, thereabouts. So maybe it was 6 years. And I've only seen, a few descriptions of that. I haven't been able to find any videos anywhere that showed the whole thing. I was able to find a couple videos showing that transitional Mass. But I don't think there's anything wrong with the rubrics. And the nice thing about the rubrics is that they are vague enough to where if you have a mind of continuity with the past, that you can still make the Novus Ordo incredibly beautiful, if not, in my opinion, even more beautiful than the traditional Latin Mass was. Now, a lot of people will probably get mad at me for saying that. How could the Novus Ordo ever be more beautiful than the traditional Latin Mass? Well, I think that the vernacular, having, bits of the vernacular in there, I want to say there should still be a good amount of Latin in the liturgy. Most of the music should be in Latin, if not all of it. All of the common responses should be in Latin. Heck, I would be all for every part of the Mass that stays the same every time it's celebrated. I'd be all for all of those parts to be in Latin, because people eventually catch on and they eventually learn it. And we have problems with people being inattentive in vernacular masses. The language can help. It can be helpful, especially for first timers. But for people that have been going their whole lives, I mean, you do eventually learn what's going on. And you can have missals with you that have the English beside the Latin, and it becomes a really good educational thing, especially when it's those parts of the Mass that are regular, that happen every time. So all the opening, a lot of the opening rites, all the responses, the Eucharistic prayer, the concluding rite, things like that. And then as regards the readings, all of the opening phrases of the readings and the closing phrases of the reading, those are always the same. So I don't see any reason, ideally, why those couldn't be in Latin. For the sake of, I think one of the most important reasons for having that original language in there, that quote-unquote dead language in there, is because it conveys the mystery of the Mass. Sacramentum means mystery. So sacrament literally means mystery, and we need to reclaim that. That was something that is very easily lost if everything is made completely understandable, because then it can almost become taken for granted, and people can become more inattentive. So I think it kind of goes both ways. If you have the whole thing in Latin, and even the parts where it changes every time, and people just can't get their minds around it, it's too much, then they end up being inattentive. But if you have it all in the vernacular, I think that there can be something can be said for inattentiveness slipping in because of that as well. The Latin can actually be an aid to attention and participation, I would argue. But I would say all of the readings should be in the vernacular, and any of the other parts of the Mass that would change each time, like probably the preface and the opening and closing prayers, like the particular prayers, those will generally change. Intercessions, things like that, should be in vernacular. And I'm also one of the people, I know that there are a lot of younger priests who are not very keen on the reality of the permanent diaconate, and I just kind of scratch my head at that, because first off, on a practical note, you would think having more deacons, it only makes the liturgy more beautiful. Just on a liturgical standpoint, not talking about the service function of the deacon in the works of mercy and things of that nature, and how he can be an aid to a priest and a bishop in that sense. But just on a liturgical side of things, we could basically have the equivalent of solemn high masses in the Novus Ordo if every parish had 2 or more deacons. Now, of course, you can have priests that are deacons during a liturgy, but we have so few priests now that, and there, in a lot of places in my diocese, I know at least, there are quite a number of people desirous of being ordained deacons. And I think, as long as the Church accepts that, and as long as people aren't unduly being ordained, like ordaining copious amounts to the diaconate indiscriminately, I don't see why there's much of an issue. It only aids the priests in their daily duties. It can do a lot of hospital ministries, caring for the sick, and it will restore the male leadership in a lot of ways, because if there are lots of deacons, and this also assumes that we actually utilize the deacons who get ordained, then we won't have as many lay people doing sick calls and things of that nature. And that might sound harsh, like, oh, Parker, you're against lay people doing these things, and I kind of am. I'm very reluctant to be a Eucharistic minister or a lector or even an acolyte or like a server during Mass, because I think that those things, we still have instituted lectors and acolytes, and Eucharistic ministers of Holy Communion, it's technically extraordinary Eucharistic ministers, right? Because they're not the ordinary ministers, only clergy are. They were a concession, basically, because of the lack of priests. But I think if we have a lot of men desirous of deacons, then we don't really need the extraordinary ministers anymore, and that would only be a positive thing for the Church. Again, I'm sounding probably harsh here. There's going to be a lot of people not liking what I'm saying there also, but I think it would only be good. Yeah, I could go into that a lot more deeply, but I don't really have time. Maybe next time we have that discussion particularly on lay people's roles and what that should ideally look like. So yeah, all right, adios. Oh, real quick, please feel free to subscribe to any of my podcasts on any of the podcast players. Find me on YouTube. Please subscribe. Like me on Facebook, like the Catholicism Car channel on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're all there, Catholicism Car. And then I also have a Patreon account if you wish to support what I do at this podcast and this YouTube channel. And you can also support us on Anchor.fm. There's a support button there you click on. I also have links to all this on my website's support page at www.catholicisminthecar.com.